rather than go through each dimension in great length and details, I just want to give you 10 practical tips that can be useful in your daily work. So 10 practical implementation tips to get some results. And I'll start with the most important one. It's a lot of work. There is no way around it. So I'm sorry to break the news to you. But a public-private dialogue is a lot of hard work, and sometimes you're better off not doing it, because if it's not going to be done well, it becomes a political risk. It becomes a risk of reinforcing capture. You can legitimize people's bad behavior with a big stamp of rubber stamping on the fact that it was done through a public-private dialogue. But it's a lot of work because it needs a lot of consultation. It's a lot of work to reach out to people. This is an actual office, a picture taken in Bosnia-Herzegovina, of a regional committee of a public-private dialogue. And they were trying to get to 19 proposals, I remember. And to get to 19 proposals, they had to get more than 1,000 from entrepreneurs and filter through those and reach out through all the entrepreneurs in that community. And that's the way they decided to do it then. It's not the way that you want to do it in all the case, but that's what they decided to do. And this is an office with all the paperwork that was, necessary to classify all this and to look into books and stuff to see like are those reforms, can we do them or not? So it's just a lot of work. You got to realize that, and people need to be committed for this. Now, you need to plan for a phased and inclusive approach, and I alluded to that earlier when we talked about the governance aspect and how public-private dialogue is good for solving governance issues. Have a phased approach of first maybe assessing the field. And you need to have a strong diagnostic approach to public-private dialogue. What is currently the state of dialogue in the country? So we put together some tools that you can use, and again, you can access them through www.publicprivatedialogue.org. You can download those tools, and we have what we call a diagnostic sequence, which is some kind of a scenario through which you can that you can use with a number of templates and survey questionnaires and so on and so forth that you can use to look at what are the current mechanisms. What does the private sector think, the civil society, the government, the media, the development partners. We also look at reform that happened in the past, and we saw those reforms, were they successful because the private sector was involved or not? What was their level of involvement? If those reforms failed, we're looking at why they failed and where, and what were the gaps that could be fulfilled by a public-private dialogue. And so we're trying to measure using the evaluation wheel that you saw a little bit earlier about those 12 points. We're trying to measure each existing dialogues to see if they work or not and where are the gaps. We're looking at making an inventory of all the different business associations. I mean, you need to really get a wide understanding of the field. And one of the tools we use, it's on the bottom right, it's called the reform process table, where we measure for a number of reforms that we're looking at, what were the capacity of the private sector to engage along the process through which the reform was developed, what were their willingness to engage, what was their capability to do so, and on the government side, did they want or not to speak with the private sector, did they have the venue to do it. We're looking at a number of elements that are really important because eventually that's what constitutes the fabric of that existing relationship between the public and the private sector. And if you don't understand this well, one cannot then try to talk to the stakeholders to devise a system that will work a little bit better. And the people have to find their own way. So this kind of diagnostic, the private sector and the public sector should be involved into it so that they can actually see for themselves and do self-discovery process around there rather than consultants coming and doing it for them. And so that means a lot of consultation. This is a consultative phase that just when something is designed is to be discussed and discussed again. Here are a few examples on the slide from various countries. I recognize, I think it's Central African Republic, Senegal, maybe Nepal, Jordan, where you have the top political leaders often in a room discussing it and trying to understand with their constituents what's working, what does not work, sometimes with a diagnostic which is brought in by independent third parties, like we do sometime at the World Bank, to help spur that dialogue. And when this is done, you also need to reach to constituents, and reaching to the constituents, and once these recommendations for a structure is there, or to improve something that exists, constituent is to be reached at multiple times. They need to be reached, what we mean, at entry, during, and at exit. What we mean by that is before themes are being discussed, before actions are being proposed, it's good that surveys are being conducted, or polls, or outreach campaigns, to really understand from people what is their opinion, what's more important to them, because they are the constituents, they are the people who use those services, they're the people who use those regulations, and what's more important to them is just crucial. One cannot do a proper prioritization without that information. During the process, it's important that people stay included, because it's sometimes very, very worrying to see a closed door behind which there is a table, around which there is maybe 20, 25, 30 people who are supposed to be representative of the other constituents. But if you don't know what's happening behind that door, you'll remain very suspicious of the outcomes. And so it's very important to be very open about what's happening. Disclose the information, disseminate the information about the process. This is what we are doing. This is the findings. Here's a way for you to comment back. We can discuss it. And at exit, once reform have been passed, once action took place, the public-private dialogue can reach out to constituents as well to find out, was this good? Is it what you wanted? Is it actually working on the ground? Is there water in the well? Is a nurse in a hospital? Is there a teacher in a school? And what's good nowadays, which we couldn't do 15 years ago or 10 years ago, is that we have mobile technologies. And I don't mean that old BlackBerry that I'm still using. It must be the last one on the planet. But great mobile technologies that people have, and a lot of very high penetration rate in developing countries, where people can be connected through mobile application and engagement mechanism, ICT mediated engagements, information communication technology mediated engagement of constituents, for them to be able to get information about what's happening and feed information right there from their cell phone with mobile applications or SMS, polls, and all this. And this is, I think, a crucial means to reach out to constituents. And a lot of public-private dialogues don't do that very well, but they should do more. And we have some example of some that do well. We have good campaigns going on in Bangladesh, or that are starting in Nepal, to reach out to the women entrepreneurs, for instance, or the textile worker in Bangladesh. And we have example in DRC on budget participatory mechanism. A lot of examples of good stuff that's happening in terms of asking the constituents to participate to the decision-making process through this mobile application, but the public-private dialogue needs to do that. So reaching out to constituents is very important. Now, let me give you a third tip. You need to be targeted. You're not obliged to be targeted, and sometimes the goal of the public-private dialogue is just to define the grander, the great lines of direction for a city or a country or a sector. But we found out that it's kind of those who stay kind of targeted get the big pictures, but those who want only to stop at the big pictures have a hard time eventually to go to targeting. So we draw this chart here that goes from the soft outputs of the public-private dialogue to the very hard one, very concrete. And we tend to see that the ones where they are very concrete, the dialogue processes that output concrete things, people understand them a little bit better. And people feel them, and so therefore they support it a bit more. And we've seen a number of countries where you have the soft outputs and big conferences every year to talk about, huge white paper, but rarely very strong specific recommendation. As a result, the public sector can easily brush off the accountability fact. If we didn't ask to do this and this and this, and if we just ask to consider a number of issues in general, then it's very easy for me as a public sector to say, well, we kind of dealt with it this way. But, for the people, they can't actually measure, was this done, was it not done? So it's very hard for accountability. So here is something where we will give an advice, and the advice is to be more focused on issue-specific policy recommendations or actions between private sector entities or between public and private sector entities. But the more specific you are, the more likely you are to get to some results, and that's valid for many things in life. Here we have a breakdown. I think that's one's from Cambodia, or actually in the Mekong 2006 from, I think it's only Cambodia. On over 1,000 issues raised, we saw a lot of issues were regulatory issues, but not only. A lot of it was about clarification, and that's interesting, is that the situation on the ground was actually okay on the books, but people did not feel it on the ground. There were a difference between what was on the books from what people knew. And so it was a question of clarification. And sometimes it's because the laws are badly drafted and they're subject to interpretation, and different people have different interpretations, so you need clarification. Sometimes it's about infrastructure issue. We need a road here, we need a dam there. Sometimes institutions or full laws that needs to be changed, but it seems also that there are also enforcement issues. And I've seen in other countries a little bit more of enforcement than here, just 2% of the issues. But enforcement issues are like, well, it should happen. It's not happening. What are you doing about it as government? Because if you don't do anything about it, then there's no level playing field for me as a private sector if my neighbor is not behaving well. Which is another benefit of public-private dialogue, is that it brings self-regulation between the private sector and watching each